Hi guys! Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to show you how I made these really awesome wall hangings. They turned out so great, and I currently have a dozen or so up on my website for sale. My website is in the description, so check that out. The inspiration for this project was actually something completely different, and the idea morphed multiple times between here and there. I've seen people make handles out of thrown rings, and it looks super cool, so of course I had to try it. But I made the rings way too big, and it didn't really work out. I'll try again sometime. But meanwhile, I had these rings that I couldn't use for their intended purpose, so I just started playing around with them, and I put them together as a chain. I really like the chain, and I think it's super fun. I also thought it was maybe a bit plain and would look cool with discs of clay hanging down in the rings, but also maybe some space between the rings, which obviously isn't a chain anymore. And thus, the idea for the wall hangings came to be. These wall hangings have two main components, the rings and the discs. I'm starting out with the rings for this video, and we'll move on to the discs later on in the video. I started out by wedging clay, and as you can see, it was fairly moldy reclaim. Normally, mold is considered bad on, say, food, but for clay, it can actually improve its workability. And the mold burns out in the kiln, so it does not matter at all in the long run. Working with it can be a bit stinky, but it's fine. I didn't bother being precise on weights for these. I just grabbed a couple pounds and wedged it up. I also did the same for the red clay I'm working with and the green clay that I made by mixing my normal white clay body with green mason stain. And now I won't be showing every single step with every single clay body, as I literally have an hour and a half of footage, and something has to get cut. I do value your time. I'm not going to make you watch all of it real time. So, just know that I did the same thing with each clay body for the rings, and I'm going to jump around on the colors a bit. Once I had weighed and wedged, I threw the clay on the wheel. It may seem like the rings are not actually wheel thrown, but they are. I think throwing them rather than making a circle with a coil may have helped the rings to be more round and to not warp. Plus, I didn't have to do a ton of joints, which is always nice. To make the rings, I threw a bottomless cylinder. I centered the clay first, then when I opened up the clay, I opened it all the way to the back, so it has no bottom. Then I pulled up the walls. I threw these thicker than normal, so they'd be nice sturdy rings at the end. I did this same process with the red and the green clay. I did different amounts of clay and made narrower and wider cylinders as I wanted a variety. For the green clay, I layered it with the white clay to make a marbled look. The green isn't super green in the final result. It turned out more of a gray. It's pretty subtle, but I think it does add a nice detail to the rings. I may experiment with mixing in different, more bold mason stains in the future. I really like making these, and I can see so many possible variations, so I look forward to experimenting even more in the future. Once all the cylinders were thrown, I let them dry a while without wiring them off. Once they were around leather hard, I put them back on the wheel to form the actual rings. I did this by cutting off sections of the cylinder all the way down. I started out using a needle tool, but that didn't work very well with the somewhat firm clay, so I switched to a small knife and it worked a lot better. After cutting each section, I then smoothed the new top edge of the cylinder so that when I cut the ring, it would already be rounded on the one side. The very last section of the cylinder, I turned into a chuck of sorts by cutting away the outside edge of the ring, basically just making it thinner so the cut ring sections will be held in place by it. I then put the cut ring sections one at a time onto the chuck and trimmed the side that was flat to be rounded like the other side. This worked great and made the rings all rounded and smooth. I guess I could have left the rings totally squared off, but that didn't occur to me until I was doing this video, and I like the rounded look. Maybe something to experiment with later though. I did add some very light carving to the edges of most of the rings. It was basically just some lines periodically to add some detail. You can see it a bit on the edge of the rings. At this point, I left the rings to dry completely, and later they were single fired, but more on that later. For now, they were put on the shelf for a while to dry. Then it was time to completely and totally switch techniques and work on the discs that hang down inside the rings. These were not made on my wheel, they were cut out of a slab. I rolled out a chunk of clay using my rolling pin. I like to use this one that has a thickness guides on the ends, so I get a nice consistent thickness. I really wanted these discs to have a lot of texture, so after rolling it out, I put it on burlap and then rolled it out again before smoothing out the top. I then covered the slab with plastic wrap, which makes the clay not stick to the texture roller, and also helps a lot when cutting out with a cookie cutter, but more on that in a moment. After the plastic wrap was down, I then added texture using this cool textured roller. Actually, it's a cute little lantern that my husband cut the handle off of, and he gave it to me for Mother's Day. And he gave me the burlap for Mother's Day too. It was a long table runner that I'd cut. Now, maybe that's weird, but he had a scenario much like this in mind when he gave them to me, and it was a perfect gift. Why would I use decor for decor when I can use it for pottery texture, right? I'm glad he and I both think outside the box because I love how the texture turned out on these discs. After getting all the texture on there, I cut out the discs using a circle cookie cutter, and then used a smaller cookie cutter of different shapes to make a cutout inside the discs. This looks cool, adds interest with the different shapes, and gives me a way to tie the discs to the final wall hanging. I also did smaller discs that were just a circle with the circle cut out of it to be the very top of the wall hanging, so there's somewhere to hang it from. So back to the plastic wrap. If I wasn't using plastic wrap, the clay would likely stick to the cookie cutters and the discs would have a very blunt edge. With the plastic wrap, my cookie cutters stay clean and the top edge of the disc is rounded and makes them look nicer and it's easier to smooth out later. Lots of advantages using plastic wrap like this. After cutting out the circles and the inner shapes, I removed the excess clay and transferred the discs to a bat so I could keep them together. This excess clay will be used for more discs later as I can wedge it up and start this process over. Then, after I had a bunch done, I smoothed the edges a little. The plastic wrap made the top edge nice and smooth, but the bottom edge where the burlap was rough. So I just took a little time per disc to smooth out the bottom edge. I also repeated the same exact process to make more discs, but with bubble wrap rolled into the top for the texture. It also turned out really well. For the discs with the bubble wrap texture, I left them bare, but for the ones with the texture made with a yellow lantern, I added blue underglaze after they dried. I thinned out blue underglaze with a little water and then brushed it onto both sides of the disc. I just did one coat and then wiped it back a bit on the burlap textured side to add more contrast with the other side of the disc and because I just like how it made the texture stand out. Then after all the discs and all the rings were fully dry, I loaded them into my kiln for my first ever single firing. Normally I do a bisque firing, which is a lower temperature, then I glaze my pots, and then I fire them again at a higher temperature. However, since I wasn't glazing these pieces at all, I figured it was a good time to try out single firing and skip the bisque firing altogether. Most of the kiln was taken up by the rings and discs, but I also had some glazed planters in that load, and it all turned out really great. The rings and discs all turned out awesome with no explosions or warping. I love it when things come out of the kiln looking so great. After unloading all the many pieces out of the kiln, the fun was not over. Now it was time to put it together into the wall hangings. I could tell you all about how I put them together using all these design methods and techniques, but let's be honest, it was trial and error. I wanted a variety of colors in each and different size rings, and other than that, I just went for it till it looked good. The beauty of these pieces is that they all are totally mix and match, and they all look good together anyway, so it's not that hard to make it look good. I used hemp twine to tie the rings and discs together. This part was slightly tricky, especially deciding what knot to use. Not exactly my strong suit. It's not that I'm bad at knots, but I don't tend to need a lot on a daily basis. I ended up using a constrictor knot, and it worked great. I also used glue to make sure all the knots would stay secure, so none of the pieces would fall off and break, just to have some extra assurance. Then I cut the excess twine off, and they were done, and they look so amazing! They also sound really cool when they move. I mean, I wouldn't call them quite wind chime level, but it's a pretty cool unexpected bonus nonetheless. I've had to move them a few times when I was doing my example market setup, and they didn't have any issues at all. I just applied for a big Christmas market near me, and I'm waiting to hear back, but look how cool my setup looks, and these wall hangings look amazing on the backdrop. I'm super duper happy with how they turned out. So be sure to check these out on my website as they are up and ready to sell now. Also, check out my latest kiln unloading. I especially love how the bowls and donuts turned out. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.